Welcome to the Dragon Soul Breakdown series. These breakdowns will give you a detailed insight into the Dragon Soul 10-man heroic encounters. In this video, I'll break down the Morchok fight so that you have the tools to get the fight done. During the guide, I'm going to cover the entire fight mechanically, as well as giving you a recipe for how to finish the encounter in its entirety. This fight consists of two phases, which alternate on a timed basis. The first phase is referenced as the crystal phase and will last approximately 1 minute per cycle. Following a crystal phase, we will see a black blood phase, which will be up for approximately 20 seconds before going back to the crystal phase. The entire encounter should be one of the easier fights during Dragon Soul and will be very short due to the low HP pool of the boss. You will start by pulling Morchok and get him down to 90% HP before anything interesting happens. Once he reaches 90% HP, he will split into two smaller versions of himself called Morchok and Korkrom. The bosses share HP pool similar to Rhyolith's legs and Firelance, so cleaving and multi-dotting them when possible will significantly speed up your kill times. Once the boss is split, you will divide your raid into two 5-man groups, which will separate the bosses and handle each respective boss like a dungeon boss on steroids. For this fight, you'll need 2 tanks, between 2 to 4 healers, and between 4 to 6 DPS. During early progression, this fight will be quite tough on your healers due to the very big numbers and spiky damage profile. So in terms of sheer throughput, you might struggle with only 2 healers. You can safely use 4 healers for this fight if you want a much easier kill, since the HP pool of the boss is so low. Let's start off by looking into the mechanics of the encounter. You'll start in the crystal phase and have 2 important mechanics which needs to be considered. The first mechanic is called Stomp, where Morchok and Korkrom will stomp the ground, dealing very high damage in a 25-yard radius. The damage is split among all targets in the area, so you'll make sure that each of the 5-man groups are within the radius. Apart from the distributed damage, 2 things will happen on each stomp. First, the boss will deal double damage to the tank and the closest target. So, you will have to have a designated stomp soaker taking extra damage from each of the stomps. It's important to note that the determination of who takes the double damage will be the person standing closest to the tank and not the boss itself, so the stomp soaker needs to stack on top of the tank for each of the stomps. Secondly, the boss will apply a debuff on each person hit by stomp, increasing their physical damage taken by 100% for 10 seconds. This emphasizes that each group has appropriate spacing between each other so that the stomps do not overlap. Additionally, tanks should try to keep defensives up for this portion so that the healers can focus on topping the group. Before we go into the second mechanic of the crystal phase, let's talk about the stomp soaker a bit. Since the stomp damage is high physical damage, you want a DPS class which can either roll defensives to mitigate as much damage as possible, or use a class with high armor and HP. In the majority of cases, a melee DPS will be well suited for this task. Some classes excel in particular with soaking this mechanic due to their kits. Rogues can use Feint for each of the stomps. Red Paladins can use Unglyphed Divine Protection. Warriors and Unholy Death Knights generally have some defensives but hold high armor and HP to survive. Boomkins can swap into bear form or use their inherit armor from Moonkin form, and there are also many other alternatives which will not be covered in this guide. This mechanic will require some adaptation based off your raid composition, but in general, using any melee DPS should get the job done. Moving on to the second mechanic of the crystal phase, called Resonating Crystal. Once used, Morchok and or Korkrom will shoot a red blob towards a nearby location, which spawns a Resonating Crystal. The Resonating Crystal lasts for 12 seconds, and during its presence, it will channel a beam towards the closest 3 players. After 12 seconds, the crystal explodes and deals damage to the players which the beams are connected to. The beams will change colors depending on your proximity to the crystal. When you're far away from the crystal, the beam is red. When you're in medium distance, the beam will turn yellow, and once you're close, it will turn blue. When the crystal explodes, it will deal damage the further away you are from the crystal, so you should always stack on top of it to minimize the damage taken. In general, I would recommend each respective tank to soak the crystal explosion together with 2 ranged DPS. By doing this division, only the tank and the ranged DPS needs to move a lot during the fight, so that the healers can stand still as much as possible and focus on topping their groups. Also, the Stomp Soaker is already taking big damage from each of the stomps, so by letting the range DPS and tank take the crystal explosion, the healers do not need to stress as much with topping the Stomp Soaker. Now that all mechanics are accounted for, how do we practically handle the crystal phase? If we're looking at the fight on a broad perspective, the bosses will have offset timers, meaning that their stomps and crystals do not activate at the same time. This insight will help us when we get into talking about the transition to the second phase, but for now, let's look at each of the bosses isolated. For each of the bosses and each cycle of the crystal phase, the sequence of actions is very projected. The boss will start by spawning a crystal. Once a crystal is spawned, he will stomp, and then you will have a few seconds before the crystal explodes. This pattern will essentially force you to wait for a stomp before your crystal soakers move over to the spawned crystal. Since there is an offset between the boss timers, the group that is hitting Morchok will have time period of approximately 10 seconds where nothing interesting happens before phase 2 is initiated. If you wish to min-max your damage output on the bosses, the Morchok grouping used this time period to run over to Core Chrom, stacking the bosses for multi-dotting and cleave damage, which is good time to Bloodlust if zerging the boss. Once you get back into the crystal phase, you will have a grace period of approximately 20 seconds before Morchok casts Stomp again, so you can keep them stacked for 15 seconds to optimize your DPS output before returning to the previously explained strategy for the crystal phase. If you execute this correctly, you should only have to experience 2 crystal phases during the encounter, but if you're playing it safe or opting for more than 2 healers, you should expect more. Next, we're moving into the Black Blood phase. The phase lasts for 20 seconds and will essentially be a bit of a recovery period for your raid. You're gonna start by being pulled in under the boss. Pillars will have formed around the playable area, which you will run to and break line of sight. After a few seconds, the bosses will shoot out black blood from their position, which deals ramping damage for 15 seconds before returning to the crystal phase. The easy way to deal with this is to run behind a pillar and prepare for the next phase. However, this portion of the fight is where you can save a lot of time by dishing out DPS and cheesing a bit of extra damage onto the bosses. Death Knights in general do not need to run to a pillar, but can stay near the bosses and attack them and pop AMS when 8 seconds remain of their cast. Range DPS can find 2 adjacent pillars and stand a bit behind them in order to still be able to attack the bosses, but this is not needed if you want a safe clear. Once the Black Blood phase is over, you will return to phase 1 and repeat until the boss reaches 20% HP, in which we encounter the last mechanic. Once the bosses reach 20% HP, they gain the Furious buff. This buff will increase attack speed by 30% and damage done by 20%, so rolling personal CDs, raid cooldowns, and Bloodlust are well suited during this portion of the fight to get it done. And that wraps up the Morchok 10-man heroic guide. I want to thank you all for your continued support during the last couple of months. I'm going to continue uploading and refining my Dragon Soul guides for the upcoming months, after which I will switch focus to mob content, so make sure to drop a subscription so you don't miss out. You should leave a like if you enjoyed the video and comment if you have requests for future guides. See y'all next time.